Former FBI agent Mike German's new book is Thinking Like a Terrorist. He recalls his work as a covert counterterrorism agent and suggests new ways for the U.S. government to fight terrorism. His talk from the ACLU's Washington, D.C. Legislative Office is about an hour, 10 minutes.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us here today. I'm Caroline Fredrickson. I'm the director of the Washington Legislative Office of the American Civil Liberties Union. And I'm very proud to stand here to introduce my colleague, Mike German, who is going to speak to you tonight about his book and about his experiences at the FBI and also at the ACLU. As you might guess, Mike has an interesting background for someone who works at the ACLU. And some people might think that the FBI and the ACLU are strange bedfellows. But Mike has always been on the same side, and that's the side of the Constitution. When he went to work for the FBI, he said he wanted to defend America and defend our Constitution. And that's the same reason that he came to the ACLU. Mike, as you will hear, is a scholar, a teacher, a policy expert, an advocate, and a voice of reason in a debate that often aims to raise our passions more than it invites us to raise questions. Mike has never been afraid to ask questions. He spent 16 years at the FBI, infiltrating neo-Nazi groups and shutting down domestic terrorists. And he did it all without betraying the Constitution. In fact, he did it while defending the Constitution. We could not be more pleased to have him here with us. His lessons in the field, working in law enforcement, help us every day with our national security work, especially in making the case that we can be both safe and free. As a professor at the National Defense University, Mike examines the most effective methods to gather intelligence. His insight and scholarship reinforce the work of the ACLU and give another dimension to our fight to defend the Constitution. And as you can tell, Mike is a committed defender of civil liberties and a true pleasure to work with. He is living proof that you can fight terrorism without betraying American values. Please join me in welcoming my colleague, Mike German.
Appreciate that. Thank you, Caroline. I appreciate that, and I appreciate everybody coming. This has turned out much more than I expected when Caroline and Liz Rose came to me and said that the ACLU wanted to throw me a party. I didn't expect anything like this, so I do appreciate it. And I appreciate everything the ACLU has done for me since I left the Bureau, both as a whistleblower in supporting me in that endeavor, and also since I've come here full time. It's really been a wonderful opportunity for me to continue working on the issues that I think are very important, especially during the current situation that we're involved with. I'll go ahead and start a little bit of the reading, a little bit about the book. People ask me how long it took me to write the book, and it's a hard question to answer because in a certain way I've been writing it since 1992, the first time I was asked to go undercover to infiltrate a neo-Nazi terrorist organization. And what I learned was very different from what I expected to see when I got there. So I started right after that case trying to educate people within the FBI and the law enforcement community. And since leaving the FBI, had the wonderful opportunity to work at the National Defense University and continue that effort to educate people about this threat. And now at the ACLU, working as an advocate, trying to push these theories even further, I think is a wonderful opportunity. But I'll just go ahead and get started from the reading. As the fifth full year of America's global war on terrorism wound down, the U.S. National Counterterrorism Center statistics revealed that the number of international terrorist attacks in 2005 more than tripled those in 2004. A year earlier, the same agency reported a similar tripling of attacks in 2004 as compared to 2003. which had seen the highest number of terrorist incidents recorded in the previous 21 years. U.S. Defense Secretary Donald Rumsfeld once complained that he lacked metrics necessary to measure success in the global war on terrorism. But this data reflects a disturbing trend. And as the number of terrorist attacks continues to increase, so do the number of terrorists. Porter Goss, then Central Intelligence Agency's director, told Congress in early 2005 that Islamic extremist groups were exploiting the war in Iraq to recruit and train a new generation of terrorists. As of this writing, the primary leaders of al-Qaeda and the Taliban remain at large. Deadly insurgencies rage in Iraq and Afghanistan, and representatives of the U.S. designated terrorist organization won parliamentary elections in the Palestinian territories and in Lebanon. I might add there that in the year since I wrote that sentence, of course, it's not changed. And in fact, the 2006 statistics show terrorism increased globally another 25%. And the just recently released National Intelligence Estimate says that al-Qaeda is as strong as it was pre-9/11. So obviously, things aren't going the way they should be. A 2006 Department of Defense counterterrorism study reportedly identified 30 new al-Qaeda-affiliated terrorist groups that have been created since 9/11. We may not have metrics to measure our success, but these realities certainly illuminate our failures. And if the global war on terrorism's goal is to stop terrorism, we are clearly losing. But why? It's certainly not a lack of effort. The U.S. military, the most skilled and equipped force in the history, is engaged in Afghanistan, Iraq, and other untold places around the globe, demonstrating a national will to go on the offensive against terrorists and the states that sponsor them. U.S. intelligence and law enforcement agencies are now focused on counterterrorism as their top priority, and they're strengthening the country's defenses as never before. Congress has provided ample funding and has given the administration unprecedented powers to act against threats to national security. The American public has become more vigilant and has generously sacrificed civil liberties in exchange for greater security. The government has taken the gloves off and adopted aggressive techniques that once might never have been considered: extrajudicial arrests and detentions, renditions, secret prisons, and torture. Yet the number of terrorists and the number of terrorist attacks keeps growing. What more can we do? The overarching problem, I believe, is a fundamental failure to understand terrorists, who they are, how they operate, and most important, why they think using indiscriminate violence will get them what they want. Our failure to understand them is peculiar because terrorism is all about the message, and terrorists are vocal about who they are, what they want, and how they intend to get it. They're prolific writers and enthusiastic public speakers, but we rarely pay enough attention to what they write or what they say. Their words are dismissed as propaganda, hate speech, and the rantings of madmen. In remarks criticizing leaks from the U.S. intelligence community, White House spokesman Trent Duffy once said, quote, "The fact is, al-Qaeda's playbook is not printed on page 1, end quote. But he was wrong. The al-Qaeda playbook was published years ago, in fact, and updates appear regularly on the internet and in audio and video recordings. These messages clearly delineate the group's operational goals and forecast their expected results. Incredibly, the U.S. government's responses often fulfill these predictions. Since September 11th, U.S. politicians often refer to the global war on terrorism as a new kind of a war, but it isn't new. Modern-day terrorists follow strategies pioneered centuries ago by zealots, thugs, and assassins, ancient groups of varying ethnic, religious, and national origin who used bloody murder as a tool of political intimidation and earned permanent places of infamy in our lexicon. Those al-Qaeda hijackers who used small knives to take over 4 planes on 9/11 were throwbacks to the zealot Sicarii, known literally as dagger men, and to the assassins who, as their ideological descendants, were never expected to survive their attacks. Today, when U.S. political and military leaders speak of our enemies, they often refer to them as zealots, thugs, and assassins without even a hint of irony. While al-Qaeda follows its ancient game plan, American leaders pretend it's all brand new. This failure to look at our past is a mistake. Our history and that of other nations' struggles with terrorism over the years provides a treasure trove of intelligence, a virtual guidebook for objectively analyzing which counterterrorism measures work and which do not. History shows us what our enemies might do next and what effect our policies have on their ability to recruit new members. organize new attacks, and achieve their ultimate political goals. But this intelligence is also ignored. We focus almost exclusively on what we don't know in formulating counterterrorism policies, the who, the where, and the when of the next attack, instead of focusing on what we do know. We spend our resources setting up protective security, hardening targets, and limiting public access to places we think terrorists might strike. We demand more intelligence. We scrutinize everyone a little more carefully. We collect vast amounts of data, like stacks of hay, in the hope that the needle we're looking for will somehow be found among the chaff. But putting our energies into these misguided efforts is exactly what the terrorists want us to do. And if we read what they wrote, we would know this fact. Ignoring their writings and our own history is the true failure of U.S. counterterrorism policy. Unfortunately, attempting to understand terrorists is too often mistaken for sympathizing with terrorists. In June of 2005, while defending the global war on terror, Presidential Advisor Karl Rove said, "Conservatives saw the savagery of 9/11 and the attacks and prepared for war. Liberals saw the savagery of 9/11 attacks and wanted to prepare indictments and offer therapy and understanding for our attackers." End quote. But understanding does not connote sympathy. An anti-intellectual, anti-liberal government response that favors using violence and the force of will over moral standards and the rule of law is exactly the response the terrorists need to prosper. If we better understood what terrorists wanted and what terrorists feared, we would see a better outcome. When a misunderstanding of the enemy and his goals drives U.S. counterterrorism policies, we shouldn't be surprised at the results. A small, stateless band of organized criminals spent years calling for an international holy war, and we responded with a global war on terrorism. Does this make sense? I didn't know much about terrorism in 1992 when I was selected to go undercover and penetrate neo-Nazi skinhead groups conspiring to start a race war in Los Angeles. But I spent the next dozen years learning about it from the most knowledgeable instructors on earth. They weren't from the FBI, from some university or government think tank. Everything I know about terrorism I learned from terrorists. To become a terrorist, I needed to learn things other students of terrorism usually didn't. To successfully infiltrate the white supremacist world, I needed to know not just their ideology, their motivations and their methods, but even what they ate for breakfast, and more importantly, what they didn't eat. As I immersed myself in their world, they challenged my preconceptions. I didn't find crazed, hate-filled lunatics, but instead thoughtful, committed, true believers and idealists who felt their use of violence was morally justified and necessary to secure their community's survival. This idealism separates them from ordinary criminals, and it's what makes them so dangerous. As Brian Flanagan, a former member of the Weather Underground organization, once put it, quote, "If you think you have the moral high ground, that's a very dangerous position, and you can do really dreadful things," end quote. When I went undercover, I discovered an enigmatic underground community living right here in the United States that were actively but surreptitiously at war with mainstream society. I met middle-class suburban families, teenage honor students, educated professionals, and businessmen, and people you pass in the supermarket every day without a second glance. But I know they were part of a secret war because I bought their bombs, stored their weapons, and listened in as they planned horrific terrorist attacks. I spent months at a time working directly with people who conceived, planned, and committed terrorist acts of violence. And all the while, they considered themselves the good guys, soldiers in a just cause making personal sacrifice for their community's benefit. I learned their secrets because they spoke to me and trained me as if I was one of them. I learned that despite my abhorrence for their ideologies, I had far more in common with these terrorists than I ever would have imagined. And this insight allowed me to quickly infiltrate their ranks and gain their trust, only to betray them before they could accomplish their awful goals. But by living among terrorists, I got to know them as rational, thinking human beings whose violence, though cruel, was chillingly calculated to help them reach specific, articulated goals. I learned how terrorist groups recruit, indoctrinate, organize, and operate. As I prepared for assignments against right-wing, left-wing, and Islamic fundamentalist terrorists, I learned how to see the world through their eyes. I learned how to think like a terrorist. I learned that despite differing and even conflicting ideologies, their motives and methods were the same. Most important, I learned if I wanted to stop them, I had to understand them. And if I wanted to understand them, I needed to pay attention to what they wrote and listen to what they said. The bad news is that terrorists have a real plan, a blueprint that has brought them victory in the past, and they're executing that plan perfectly today. The good news is their plan is published and available to anyone who bothers to read it. Once the terrorist plan is understood, developing a counter strategy is easy. In this book, I use my unusual education as a terrorist to explore why terrorism is such a persistent and difficult problem. I show how and why terrorism works, and in turn, why our current approach to counterterrorism isn't working. I expose inherent biases in the language we use to discuss terrorism. These biases blind us to the true nature of the problem we face and prevent us from developing effective policies to stop it. I expose the terrorist's true goal, and I reveal what the terrorists fear most. Thank you.
I think, obviously, Mike is here to answer your questions, so we have time for that. And I'll jump in just to say thanks to Mike for that terrific reading. You can see what a wonderful colleague he is to have here at the ACLU and what insights he brings to the work that we do to keep us safe and free.
Thanks. Yes?
Do I have to wait for a microphone?
Yeah, right behind you there.
Thank you. My name is Frank Fletcher. My question is, I had taken a course back a few years ago after September 11th at Georgetown University, a non-credit course, and the instructor was saying that the right-wing extremist groups that you infiltrated were very sophisticated in their use of technology, of the internet, of sophisticated communications. What was your experience with that? And as sort of the other side of the coin, they must have watched you a lot. How were you able to communicate with the FBI? And you must have had to have been very careful.
In the first part of your question with the use of technology, the first time I ever heard the term email was from a group of neo-Nazi skinheads in 1992. And I don't know how many people here were on the internet in 1992. I was with the FBI, and we weren't on the internet in 2002. So it was a completely strange idea to me, but they were telling me about these electronic communications that could go over the internet, and I had never heard of the internet. And these were, what would normally be considered, if most people described what they thought of as skinheads, are the dregs of society, and yet these groups were actually on the internet communicating. And part of what I talk about in my book is how clandestine groups organize. And necessity is the mother of invention, and one of the things they realize quickly is it's very difficult for them to survive when they've declared open warfare against the government they live under. So they have to find clandestine ways to communicate, and whatever avenues are cut off to them, they find another way. So that's why they're actually pioneers in a lot of those technologies, and so far ahead of what we're doing. And the second question, I mean, obviously I can't get into specific methods, but I like to think I was just smarter than them. But no, I mean, there were some tried and true methods that the FBI uses, and just being very careful. And of course, you just have to be better lucky than good. Hi, Dane.
Michael, I'm sorry. Can you hear me okay?
And if you'd introduce yourself as well, Dane.
Yeah, I'm Dane von Breikenrückert, president of the U.S. Bill of Rights Foundation. And we work very closely with ACLU, but work closely with everybody.
Yeah.
Keep your friends close. My question is, when we think about terrorist groups in the United States, we think about the homegrown neo-Nazi types, and we sort of, they are so buffoonish, we sort of think, well, the worst they'll do is blow a church up or something. But then we think about the cells that could be developing here from.
Right.
Are we thinking too narrowly? Are there more? In other words, how many terrorist groups do we have here in the United States that can seriously do us harm? I mean, are we dealing with just some of the small potato, like I said, skinheads, and then the only real thing we got to worry about is Al-Qaeda? Or do we have others that we're not thinking about and talking about?
Well, it's interesting, and I get that question a lot, because we do tend, for those same reasons that we tend to see skinheads as buffoonish, to forget them as a serious threat. And what I tell people to remember is that, Al-Qaeda failed in their first attempt to take a building down in this country, where Tim McVeigh succeeded. They are still very capable. And when I talk to military personnel about this problem, I often say, if you were starting a terrorist group, would you rather have somebody who trained in an Afghan terrorist camp or somebody who trained where Tim McVeigh trained, which was the U.S. military, the best military in the world? And they recognized very quickly that that training is far greater and far more effective than any training somebody receives in a terrorist training camp somewhere. So there are many terrorist groups out there, and the fact of the matter is, you know, even somebody like Ted Kaczynski proved that one guy and you know, handmade tools can be a very effective terrorist. And part of the problem that I talk about in my book is the intelligence community's inability to understand what it is they are facing. You know, even today, to get somebody to describe what Al-Qaeda is very difficult. And you hear a lot of terrorism experts talk about this genius transition that Al-Qaeda made after 9/11, where they went from being a state-sponsored terrorist group with a safe haven in Al-Qaeda to this loosely affiliated group of autonomous cells that are operating independently without any connections. And they act like that was some, you know, very sophisticated technique. Well, back in 1982, Louis Beam wrote Leaderless Resistance that explained exactly how to do that. These are techniques that the white supremacist community wrote about, literally published papers about 20, 30 years ago. So this is nothing new. They're actually following in the footsteps of the white supremacists rather than vice versa. So, you know, part of it is understanding who is really the subject that you're looking to get, and, you know, putting names on them and categories on them and trying to do, you know, the organizational chart doesn't work with these groups. That's not what it's about. It's about convincing somebody that there is a right that needs to be redressed, that some government has taken your rights, and the only way you can get them back is through an act of violence. And it's a very sophisticated plan, but it's very simple. And if we looked at it, we would see that they are moving precipitously through their strategy while we're still stuck on stage one, stopping the attacks.
My name is Corey Owens, and I just want to address something that you talked about in the reading. I understand why, say, if the FBI is tapping my phone, there's a civil liberties concern. But you talked about the hardening of targets and things like that, and there are definitely measures that have been taken on that front. And I think one of the most interesting examples has been London's Ring of Steel. And New York has now unveiled a plan that's been at least loosely modeled on London's Ring of Steel. And I guess I'd like for you to address how there's a balance there. I mean, again, the wiretapping I understand, but where is the balance between civil liberties and security when we're talking about, video cameras or whatever it might be?
Right. I think that one of our biggest problems in our response since 9/11 is that we fell into this trap of believing that there is that this paradigm is true, that if we somehow sacrifice civil liberties, our security will be better. But the London terror attacks demonstrate perfectly just the opposite. In other words, London security officials invested heavily in this Ring of Steel, thousands of security cameras all over the city of London. So, they literally say that somebody walking through the city of London on a daily basis is photographed or videotaped 300 times. And yet, when you look at the July 7th, 2005 bombings, it did nothing to stop these young men from putting the bombs on their back and walking into the subway and blowing it up. It's not a preventative tool. Likewise, 4 other bombers did the exact same thing. Copycat attacks 2 weeks later, same subways, same method. And they weren't stopped except by their own incompetence in making bombs. And that really shows how these technological advancements are gathering tremendous amounts of unnecessary data about innocent people just going about their daily lives. And because they're not focused on the bad guys, they miss what is the critical tool. So it's that haystack problem where you've collected so much hay you can't get it. And the most important thing to know about the 7/7 bombings is 3 out of the 4 people involved in that, it was later determined, had come up in previous counterterrorism investigations. And the unnamed official who was defending Scotland Yard's lack of response said, hey, we only have finite resources. But it's not that they have finite resources, it's that they chose to spend their resources on a technology that doesn't work. There have been studies that show these surveillance cameras do not reduce violent crime. Lighting does reduce violent crime. You know, simple techniques will work. So if we're investing millions of dollars in techniques like these surveillance cameras, we're selling our security short and we're actually making ourselves less secure. I'm sorry, Patrice.
Patrice McDermott, openthegovernment.org, talked about how the technologies that undermine civil liberties don't work. I'd like you to address sort of that's the sort of government collecting information.
Right.
The other side of what happened after September 11th was the government taking down massive amounts of information and creating all these new categories, sensitive but unclassified, sensitive security information. From your experience with domestic terrorists, is there a logic, is there a rationale to taking what is open information and hiding it behind walls? Does that make us safer? Does it make us more secure?
No, it doesn't. I always say it might seem surprising for somebody whose life depended on government secrecy when I was working undercover to be an advocate of transparency in government. But, you know, kind of the larger part of your question, you know, what we should have learned from 9/11, that the lack of transparency in the intelligence community is what allowed the decay and the mismanagement that was the actual cause of the problem. It was never a collection issue, right? The 9/11 Commission report would have been 5 pages long if it was a collection issue. They would have said, you know, we all woke up Tuesday morning and there was this big explosion. It's not what happened. There was plenty of intelligence. It's that intelligence was mismanaged. Well, instead of addressing that mismanagement issue, we gave the intelligence community more money, more authority, and they're less accountable. And that's really, you know, ultimately going to prove catastrophic because those management problems have not been addressed. And the perfect example is the FBI's, the Inspector General's report on the FBI's misuse of its National Security Letter Authority. You know, where the only way that, you know, and for the director and the leadership of the FBI to say, oh my God, we had no idea this was so bad is even worse. You know, it's like if you don't even know what's going on in your own agency, how can you be effectively protecting us from the security threat? Because it's not just that when that data is mismanaged that it's a civil liberties and privacy concern. It's that those are the people responsible for our security, and if they're so mismanaging what they're doing, obviously they shouldn't be trusted to be protecting our security.
Can you talk about the collusion between the neo-Nazis and the Islamicists?
In a limited way. The case that I left the FBI over was a case in which supporters of an Islamic terrorist organization reached out to a white supremacist organization after 9/11, basically, you know, because they were less able to do what it was they wanted to do. They thought by reaching a white audience or white operatives, they would be more effective. And, you know, which made perfect sense to me. I mean, I knew it was only a matter of time before that would happen because, again, the people who are actually doing the terrorism, the operators, the individuals in the groups that are actually doing bad things, are very different from the ideologues. You know, the ideologues spend time writing books, putting up websites, doing all those things, and preaching, where, you know, I mean, that's where the Founding Fathers were so genius. We shouldn't worry about them because they're not hurting anybody. You know, the operators are very different, and they are much more able to compromise their ideology to accomplish their military objective. And that's what we don't quite understand yet in our counterterrorism response. And that's why somebody who was an Islamic fundamentalist could cooperate with a white supremacist and vice versa, even though their ideological goals and political goals were very different. Their operational goals were exactly the same. So, you know, that is something that's extraordinarily dangerous. And, you know, unfortunately, the FBI, in trying to prove that, are trying to argue that that they hadn't messed up that case, actually suppressed the transcript of that meeting. And it wasn't until this March, 4 years after the event, that Senator Grassley put portions of it into the official record so that you can see exactly how it operates. And that, again, I mean, what an intelligence failure that we have this tape of these terrorists conspiring, and yet the intelligence community has never seen it because the FBI was suppressing it because they had messed up the case and didn't want to admit it. You know, and that's an intelligence failure. But frankly, in my cases, you know, one of the problems with a lot of the analysis about terrorism by these so-called terrorism experts is they've never actually talked to a real terrorist in most cases, or if they have, they find them in prisons, or they're talking to sort of the media outreach groups rather than actual people who are operating that I was hanging around with. And because of that, their analysis is somewhat skewed because they're not paying attention to the operators. So.
One of the problems of comparing the Constitution with the Code of Hammurabi is that habeas corpus becomes habeas corpse. It only takes a few jerks to destroy things and then create tremendous fear. That happened in Washington with the snipers. The whole city was brought to its knees. Right now, what's going on are hit-and-run killers who believe in reincarnation or program people to believe in reincarnation. How do you deal with that?
I think that my cases proved that you could deal with that using constitutionally sound law enforcement techniques. It's really no different. I mean, as Tim McVeigh proved, he was able to destroy a lot of lives. He's a criminal. That we didn't use the techniques, that we in the FBI didn't use the techniques that I used in my case, which was a year before that event, was the failure. Not that there's some magic out there that we don't know about. You know, when I came out of that year-long undercover case and the trials were all ended, I went to the FBI Domestic Terrorism Unit and said, you know, don't you want to debrief me operationally how I did this, people I met, things I did? And they said no.
Saddam kept order by butchering people tragically, terribly. The trap of the first Gulf War was it went too easily, and it was assumed that the people of Iraq would be able to take down Saddam. Saddam proved that dreadfully wrong. Everyone was kept under order by fear. That also is what's kept things going. If the comparison of what's going on now in Iraq with World War II is fallacious, if this were treated like World War II, it would have been ended a long time ago. Martial law would have been initiated. Any person with an unauthorized weapon would have been put out of business.
Right, and let me just make a point off of what you said there. You know, people, and I think this is where that paradigm of balancing security against liberty comes from, that people think that in a dictatorship there isn't terrorism. But it's because they've defined the violence and the fear in a manner that the state sponsor of that terror, a guy like Saddam Hussein, is not considered a terrorist, where, you know, certainly by what he was doing in his community, he was certainly, like you said, operating through fear. So, you know, if we define the terms in a way that it only describes certain people and not others, it makes it much more difficult to talk about what it is we're actually trying to prevent, the indiscriminate use of violence in any form.
Anyone can get it wrong. The idea is to get it right as quickly as possible. The plane bombings occurred because no one thought that somebody would be so vicious enough to use planes to hit essentially easy targets. Once those planes were up in the air, it was all over.
And, you know, as I said, there was plenty of intelligence, and the fact that they didn't manage the intelligence properly to interdict the threat is what we should be trying to correct, not expanding our intelligence capabilities.
I think there are other people with questions, so we'll run out of time otherwise.
Joe McDonough from the FBI.
Welcome.
Just had a general question. What you think of the work of the 9/11 Commission and the implementation of those ideas at this point? Any reaction?
Well, you know, it's interesting. I think the work they did as far as ferreting out the facts was very good. I mean, it's a very fact-heavy report that I refer to often in talking and teaching about terrorism. in their conclusions, they make interesting conclusions that don't comport with those facts, though. For instance, there's the line about the FBI, that the FBI's problem is that it puts too much emphasis on its criminal justice mission as opposed to its intelligence mission. Well, you and the FBI know, and for everybody else who doesn't, the FBI has always had an intelligence mission, and even in its criminal justice mission, had intelligence capabilities. I mean, certainly the undercover work I did, there was a lot of intelligence collection going on in that. So it was a misnomer to suggest that in the first place. But in the second place, if you look at the list of 15 or so what they call missed operational opportunities, not a single one has to do with the failure of a law enforcement technique or the failure of a law enforcement officer. They're all on the intelligence side of the house, and primarily it's not even personal failings as much as it is caused by the rules about classification of intelligence. So that one agent felt that the rule prevented him from sharing it with another agent. And in most cases, their analysis was that the rules actually didn't. It was a misunderstanding of the rule. But those classification rules haven't been changed. So the idea that we've somehow improved what we're able to do without making those fundamental changes, I think is ridiculous. And when you talk about what, and having worked in task forces pretty much my whole career, the guys on the street, the cops out there on the street are the eyes and the ears to protect this country, and that classification issues are still preventing those people from getting the information they need. And, that's been a problem forever, but that's a problem that's not being addressed properly.
Hi. My name is Ann Gordon. I guess I had two comments that may raise some questions. The descriptions of, how our Secretary of Defense has talked about people who want to be understanding. In the 40s, we had the same issue when the China hands reported on what was actually happening with the Chinese Revolution, and they were all purged from the State Department, leaving a generation of Foreign Service officers who were afraid to report the truth. And secondly, I sat on an interagency working group for a year and a half to respond to September 11, to respond to the failure of the State Department in issuing student visas to the hijackers. And so a lot of people were engaged for a lot of time to come up with a 2-page document to say we need to be a little careful, or more careful on student visa issuance. Which,
and again, it sort of goes to that same theme that the intelligence is out there, people are trying to tell them the right thing, and just like you said, the whistleblower issues. I mean, here I had worked in the FBI for 14 years at the time I reported this misconduct, had very successful cases under my belt, had never been in any sort of disciplinary problems. I had a transcript of the event that they were saying didn't happen. I assumed that my reporting it would be welcomed with open arms, but I found very much the opposite. And that is causing catastrophic problems, and you look at what facts we can point to, that the NSL report again. If agents in the field could have felt comfortable reporting what was happening, perhaps it wouldn't have gotten out of hand before they learned about it. And one of the important things about the IG report is he talks about the FBI attorneys in the field, the chief division counsels and associate division counsels. And he said in interviews with them, they said they didn't feel they could, their approval is necessary to get a national security letter. But they felt that they couldn't exercise independent legal judgment because in opening the case, their boss, the special agent in charge, had already made the factual determination that an investigation needed to be open. So they felt that if I say an NSL isn't appropriate, I'm contradicting my boss, and my career will suffer. So the IG highlighted that as a specific problem. In the rollout of the new guidelines the FBI has put in to correct this problem, that issue isn't addressed at all. It's left exactly as it was, where these lawyers are simply told it's your job to independently say whether there's enough legal evidence. Well, if they know I'm going to get my career ended if I exercise my legal judgment, they won't do it. And it was interesting. We went to the FBI to talk about the the new guidelines with them. And one of the things they said in their new compliance program is that they were going to have an anonymous hotline so people could report. Now, first of all, they did point out that the FBI would probably be able to figure out who's calling the anonymous hotline in the first place. But in the second place, why would a law enforcement office need an anonymous hotline for people to report violations of the law? Only if you fundamentally understand that people are not rewarded for telling the truth about what's happened. So that's the fundamental problem, and those are the sorts of things that need to be fixed to reform our intelligence community, but it's not happening, or not quickly enough anyway.
There's a question up here, Mike. Right here, this young man.
So clearly, terrorism is a global phenomenon. Are there governments that you have observed do a better job of balancing effectively battling terrorism while preserving liberties of their states?
Yes, there are examples of that, and one of the great opportunities for me is to be able to teach at the National Defense University, where we have military officers from other countries come in and talk about the issues that they're facing in their countries, and some countries do it right. One of the things I do in my book is talk about where other countries have had similar problems, how they responded, whether those responses assisted the terrorists in recruiting and furthering their goals, or whether they didn't. And what you'll see in my book is that it's pretty obvious what techniques don't work. Things like indefinite detention, arbitrary detention, torture. Those things have been tried. They were tried in Algeria. They were tried in Northern Ireland. They didn't work anywhere. And having learned about terrorism from terrorists, I always like to go to see what the terrorists say. And what the terrorists in Algeria said was torture helped us. What the terrorists in Northern Ireland say is that torture helped us. There was a controversy over the Al-Qaeda manual because when people started being released from Guantanamo and reporting their treatment, the Department of Defense's response was, well, look at the Al-Qaeda manual, they're trained to lie about torture. Well, why would they be trained to lie about torture? Only if they recognize that if we complain of torture, that will work in our favor. So if you were setting up a policy, I would think that you would want to stay as far away from torture as you could get, because that's something that's really going to help them. So I think there are places that do it well. And frankly, my cases prove we can do it well here. Those cases were extraordinarily successful. They went through trials. Everybody got to judge whether the techniques I was using were appropriate. It's all on the record, and in my experience, one of the telling things to me was at the end of, I worked a case against a group in Washington, a militia group in Washington, and it was a 6-week trial, and there were a lot of supporters of the militia group who were attending the trial every day. And at the end of the 6-week trial, one of the most vocal supporters of this anti-government militia came to me and shook my hand and said, "You did the right thing. These guys were doing the wrong thing, and what you did was entirely appropriate." Now here is somebody who every fiber of his body hates the government, and I'm the worst of the government. I'm an undercover agent, somebody who sneaks into their group. So for every reason, he should not like me. But he sat through a 6-week trial, saw the evidence, saw me get cross-examined, and approved of what happened in the end, because there was that transparency. And that showed me that you could change those minds that you were talking about by having a transparent system where people are treated fairly and their rights are protected.
Hi, I'm Rihanna Pfefferkorn. I'm with the Center for Democracy and Technology. Building on the last question, a lot of emphasis has been placed on your ability to do your job effectively domestically while still respecting the tenets of the Constitution. My question is, given that so much of the focus now is on solely foreign intelligence gathering rather than purely domestic or between domestic and foreign parties, do you think that operating within the bounds of the Constitution in those intelligence gathering activities can be effective, and that it's something that should be advocated even though the Constitution has no extraterritorial application?
One of the things that I point out when I teach to law enforcement audiences, I always ask this question. where, whether the Fourth Amendment makes you more efficient or less efficient at your job. And usually right away they say less efficient, which of course makes sense, because if you don't have to write out your evidence and go bring it to a judge and get a warrant, of course you could do your search more quickly. But then I ask them the next question: if you didn't have to get a warrant, what would you do every single day? And they all have the same answer: kick doors. And I say, exactly right, and what would you find? And that's when they come to realize that what they would find is they're wasting their time more often than not, which is sort of what's happening now with these intelligence collection systems that aren't based on a reasonable expectation that somebody's involved in criminality. The Fourth Amendment is designed to force government to be more efficient with its resources, so that if I have no, as a criminal investigator, I came to work every day wanting to be one day closer to putting the handcuffs on the bad guy. And if I came in every day and picked up a phone book and said, I'll investigate this guy, I would be wasting a lot of my time investigating people and collecting evidence against people who had never done anything wrong. There's this myth out there that somehow if I have all the data, I'll know everything. Well, if that were true, every librarian would be the smartest person in town. Having the data isn't having the knowledge. And that's really the big mistake of what we're doing with these intelligence collection programs, because all we're doing is wasting our resources, number one, but number two, infringing on the rights of people who we have no business infringing on, and that way losing the respect of those people who otherwise would be supporting the government, and particularly where those efforts impact certain communities more than others, increasing that feeling of injustice that is what actually causes the recruitment process to work. So it's totally counterproductive. And I'm sorry, getting further into your question, with whether there should be extraterritorial application of the Constitution. We talk about spreading American values around the world, but when we tell them we can do things to you that we wouldn't do to ourselves, that's not spreading American values. And I think the response we would get from the international community if we did treat them as if with the same rights and dignities that American citizens are given, we would have, and in a much more transparent way, we would have a much better result than the one we're having now.
Alexander Meligishvili, Monterey Institute of International Studies. I have a sort of a two-pronged question that has to do with particular investigative techniques that are used by FBI. In particular, I'm referring to the what's called entrapment, which is when you have an informant embedded in a group.
Right.
Here I want to bring a recent case of a group in Florida. And it's very interesting because, and I want to hear what you have to say about it. What are your comments on this? Because it's very interesting, because you have a person who is almost facilitating, brings the group to the brink where sufficient evidence is collected on the intentions, while they have not even been in any advanced operational stage with regard to the plan.
Right.
So you have a situation in which he brings them, it's almost like a provocateur who provokes them. So I would like to hear what you have to say about this and about the practice of rendition as well.
Okay.
Thank you.
With the entrapment issue, of course, being an undercover agent, that was the issue. If you went into court with an undercover case, the person couldn't say, couldn't have an alibi. They're right there on tape with the agent who was with them saying it was you. They had no other defense except entrapment and government misconduct. So, as an undercover agent, that was something that I was very well trained in and very practiced in and up to date on, to make sure that before I did anything in a case, that there was a criminal predicate and predisposition documented in the file. So it wasn't, so that if it came up in court later, it would be well documented. And all through the case, I made sure that the evidence supported that these people were predicated long before they ever met me. So, it's certainly something that's important in those cases. The problem that I've seen since 9/11, and I won't comment on that case specifically because I don't know enough details about it, and it's an ongoing case. but in general, the use of informants as opposed to undercover agents. Because, while to the group being investigated, whether you're infiltrated by an undercover agent or an informant might not seem to be a big deal, I would certainly, as a civil libertarian, much rather have a trained law enforcement officer whose motives are as pure as any other law enforcement officer and, isn't there to do anything other than enforce the law, much more than I would an informant whose motives may be much different. And as cases long before our current problem have shown, informants sometimes have very complicated motivations driving their activities. And, for any law enforcement officer to wholeheartedly trust an informant is not a good idea. And as far as rendition, if you look at the terrorist argument, basically the nexus of their argument is that they're making to each other. In other words, that they're making to try to recruit is, look, you don't have to pay attention to the law anymore, okay? The other side has already broken the law, so there is no law. So that's why it's okay for us to do these horrible things. So if you're that person listening to that message over and over and resisting it, when there are such obvious violations of the law, like the rendition program, like secret prisons, like Guantanamo, like all these post-9/11 projects, that makes the terrorist job so much easier to recruit. And that's where these things are so counterproductive, because you got to remember, for these operators, they don't plan on surviving for very long. What they're interested in is not how many terrorists they have today. They're looking for how many terrorists they're going to have tomorrow and the next day and the next day. And if they can trick the government that they attack into repressing the people in their community, they win. And again, you don't have to listen to me. There's a Brazilian communist by the name of Carlos Marighella, who I talk about quite a bit in the book, because he actually wrote a manual on terrorism. And what he said is, after the terrorism start, it's easy, because the government can't do, how does he say it exactly? Actually, I have it here. I love Carlos Marighella, that's why I have it here. The government has no alternative except to intensify its repression. And I always found that very compelling, because here he is writing his strategy, and he's telling his opponent what it has to do. Now, how can he be so sure that the government has to increase its repression? Of course, that's exactly what happens in all of these attacks. The initial reaction, because the government has to respond to its community, intensifies its repression, and that's how the terrorists win. And the shame of it is not just that we would do those things that go against our nature and our heritage, but that we would do them when his book was published in 1966, I think, 1967. So this plan has been out there. I mean, it's funny that people talk about the Al-Qaeda manual. It's cribbed. The IRA Green Book, Carlos Marighella's mini manual of the urban guerrilla, these are tried and true techniques that have been documented for decades, and really longer than that. So if people paid attention to what they're actually trying to accomplish, it would be much easier to stop them. Actually,
building on the comment that you made with regards to how governments have no other option but to repress those individuals who they believe are a threat to them. Do you believe that it's intrinsic to the nature of government that they have to respond in such a way, or is there any way to change the institutional underpinnings and the institutional culture that allows for that to occur? I mean, it's kind of difficult. I mean, if these blueprints have been out in the open for decades and they're tried and true, like it worked in Algeria, worked in Vietnam, worked, et cetera, in other sorts of guerrilla and terrorist movements, why has, government institutions and intelligence communities not, clearly they know what's going on, they've read these things, you can probably read it in your intro to national security course or whatever, but why haven't they responded in an effective manner in a way that actually, works, but doesn't go back to what they've been doing for decades?
The first part of your question, and one of the things that I talk about in my book, there is a plan for defeating Carlos Marighell's plan. And it was written by a group of individuals who had used their own asymmetric war of attrition to get control of their government and actually defeat the superpower of their day, and they were the founding fathers. And what they did next was sit down and create a government that would be impervious to the same sort of technique that they used. And the Bill of Rights is a perfect counterterrorism strategy, where the First Amendment prevents you from worrying about that guy who's saying something you don't like. The Fourth Amendment compels you to focus your government efforts only on those people who you have some evidence are doing something wrong. So, I look at the Bill of Rights and the Constitution as a counterterrorism strategy. And I think if we followed them more closely, we would see they would be far more effective than what these policies have been. As far as why the intelligence community doesn't pay attention to this stuff, the cases that I worked, again, hundreds of tapes of terrorists conspiring to commit terrorist acts. They were used in evidence, they're public record. How many times do you think the FBI has gone over those tapes? None. There's plenty of intelligence out there. Why would they never debrief me? You can't answer the why of that. I mean, it really makes no sense, but it's just because those agencies are so poorly managed and there isn't the will to sort of break the doors open and look at what these agencies are like on the inside. And that's really what the shame of the post 9/11 investigations is, that they never really cracked that to look at the management problems within these agencies. I mean, you look at the National Security Agency, obviously the warrantless wiretapping program going far beyond the law, and now their efforts to get their law-breaking codified into the law. It was just a couple of months ago, the Baltimore Sun had an article where an internal survey showed the NSA was one of the most mismanaged agencies in the government. That sort of mismanagement of an agency that's there to protect us should be something that Congress really takes a look at, rather than worrying about what powers they have. Look at what they're doing with those powers. I mean, there was just a Newsweek article this week that said that they're having problems because they haven't set up the infrastructure and don't have the electricity to run their operations. Well, that's not something where they need more authority. That's something where they need to be managed better. And that's really where what could really improve the security of the United States.
All right, there's the management of various bureaucratic organizations. The FBI is a bureaucracy. But the FBI is told what to do. The FBI is also part of a political entity. And the politics comes down. The FBI doesn't operate on its own, even though people might think they do. Even the CIA is part of the government, and if they want to let them run wild, then that's, they're told run wild. But the politics is what runs these bureaucracies. And I don't think it's the bureaucracy's inability to manage themselves. They're told what to do, and they do it. And they do it great. Don't do this, and they don't do it. Do that, and they do it. And by the way, they don't have to kick in the door. They get in, and they let you know, hey, we were here.
Well, having spent a lot of time with conspiracy theorists and having worked in government a long time, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, if something can be explained by incompetence rather than conspiracy, I lean toward incompetence. And there's another FBI agent you can talk to afterwards. I was very proud of my service in the FBI. I still am very proud of my service in the FBI, and proud of the service of thousands of hardworking agents who every day risk their lives trying to keep us safe and do it within the law. I think that's important to talk about. I never, in my 16 years, ever felt there was political influence in a case. maybe I was just lucky. Certainly the revelations of the last several months about the politicization of the Justice Department under this administration are extraordinarily troubling to me, because there could be nothing worse than what you're suggesting may be true becoming true. And I think that's why we need that transparency, because if we can't know, then and having spent time in those circles where they're justifying violence based on those sorts of conspiracies, secret government programs are the conspiracy theorist playground. And that's where they're able to really make hay with their followers about, see, that's why this has to happen, and it has to happen now. And that's very dangerous.
And then you go down and you take a look at the Katrina stuff, and, it's not that the government doesn't know how to handle this kind of stuff. It doesn't, they can handle it. They didn't, though. And that sends a message. The message that I get is, don't go back to some place where you can end up 20 feet under the water. Don't go there. Get out, and we'll help you out. But don't go back. And they're not kidding.
Anything else?
Can you say a little about the distinction between domestic terrorists and Al-Qaeda? My impression, specifically with regard to their motivation and public support for them, my impression is that Al-Qaeda has made very good use of Islam as a recruiting tool and as a way of garnering support in Arab countries and Muslim countries for what they do. I don't have any sense that domestic terrorist groups have anything that's sort of equivalent to that as their tool. And as a result, I wonder if they really believe that there is a strong body of public support for what they do.
I hope you'll buy a copy of my book. Everybody's heard of the group, the Aryan Nations, I assume. Anybody know the full name of that group? The Church of Jesus Christ Christian Aryan Nations. It's a Christian identity organization. It's a religious organization that has spawned numerous terrorist groups, including the Order. There are reports that Eric Rudolph was raised in a Christian identity household. These people are doing the exact same thing, and that's a lot of what my book is about. It shows what they write and compares right next to it what Al-Qaeda writes. It's the exact same methods. They're just, but it's our own internalization of it that we don't look at Eric Rudolph as a Christian terrorist. We don't talk about Christo-fascism, where with a group that's different from what most America looks like, it's a lot easier to say there's something wrong with their belief, where most Christians would say, what Eric Rudolph did has nothing to do with me. And yet, that's not you hear commentators all the time say, we expect the Muslim community to speak out against this. Where was them saying, we expect the Christian community to say something about this? It is exactly the same thing. And the distinction between domestic terrorism and international terrorism is illusory. We didn't invent neo-Nazis. They were controlling most of Europe 60 years ago. This idea has been around a long, long time, and the idea that it's just a domestic American problem is crazy. Even today, when I was in the groups, they considered themselves an international movement. They operate internationally. They're all over the world. This is not a domestic problem. But because our intelligence community said, has to put it in a bucket, well, we'll put that in domestic. ALF, the Animal Liberation Front, started in London, has its media center, or whatever they want to call it, in Canada. And yet we call that a domestic problem. It doesn't make any sense. And we blind ourselves to what is truly going on when we do that. And if we look at what they're actually trying to accomplish, it's exactly the same.
I'm certainly interested and a little surprised to hear that. I thought one primary difference was that Al-Qaeda wants to reestablish a caliphate. And I wasn't aware that there was anything like that. That there was a united effort to force Sharia upon the rest of the world and a religious dominated political order.
You know,
is that the case with the so-called domestic terror organization?
Absolutely. Long before jihad became part of our lexicon, I was in a group that was calling for RAHOA, racial holy war. That was what we were calling for. So this idea of a holy war was part of the white supremacist movement forever.
I'm just wondering how you think Muslim Americans can help in this war against terrorism, because, I mean, we're very suspicious of, you know, the FBI and the government, and we're very, you know, wary that if we do identify somebody who is capable and willing of committing an act of terrorism, we might be afraid to come forth and report that person. I mean, what sorts of things do you think that the Muslim American community can, you know, sort of build bridges with the FBI and vice versa in order to make the country more safer?
I think use the legal process. I mean, there is a legal process in this country still, and, you know, whether it's, you know, I mean, obviously, if you know of a threat, you know, as a citizen of the United States, it's your duty to report that where you can, but also use the legal process to make sure that your rights are protected always. Whether that's, you know, to the charities that you want to donate to, or to, you know, services you want to provide, to everything you do, you have a right to do those things. And that the government would restrict those good things that the community wants to do that really improve the way the world sees America is ridiculously counterproductive to me. You know, Americans are always very charitable and don't want to see anybody suffering under any conditions, and yet to restrict charitable giving through the threat of having your funds seized or, you know, even jail will chill that sort of effort, and that's really counterproductive. So, you know, just continue doing what you're doing and work within the law to improve society for all of us.
I just wanted to say I think we should probably maybe take one more question, and then I'd like to leave some time for people to talk to Mike and get their books signed and have a little chance for private conversation. So maybe one more question?
With respect to the, you mentioned available information before 9/11, and I agree with that. But the Oklahoma memo, there was a man there who said, look, I think we have a problem, and it was ignored by headquarters. But you know, of course, I'm not in the government, and I haven't studied the memo and all the information the FBI agent had. But, I mean, this would have been targeting, I mean, I'm sure he was suspicious because they were foreigners, they were male, they were Arab, they were Muslim. I mean, maybe, was there a good reason why? I mean, I think it was that it was just ignored, like the woman in Minnesota was ignored about Moussaoui, but how could that have been worked? I mean...
well, there are actually two different instances. One was in Oklahoma, where an FBI pilot was reporting things just based on, like you say, maybe something that was inappropriate for him to be regarding as threat-related. The Phoenix memo, on the other hand, was an agent who was working counterterrorism cases, who was seeing subjects of his counterterrorism cases taking flight lessons, and he thought that was peculiar. That's pretty good reason for headquarters to have responded to that. So, you know, that was one of the examples that if the FBI had responded appropriately to that, the outcome may have been different. So, you know, where there, you know, I'm all for effective law enforcement, and where there is a logical reason to evidence to believe somebody's doing something wrong, government has a duty to investigate.
Phoenix would have been more viable to pursue than maybe Oklahoma.
Well, I don't know the facts of the Oklahoma case, but I know that in the Phoenix case, it was an agent. In other words, I don't know the facts of what he reported. You know, perhaps he reported some criminal activity that he saw taking place. But in Phoenix, it was definitely subjects of investigations.
Well, thank you, everybody, and there are books available.
Thank you very much. Thank you, sir.
Mike German is a former undercover counterterrorist agent for the FBI. For more on thinking like a terrorist, visit the publisher's website at PotomacBooksinc.com.